Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. My name is Michelle Medea. I'm Director of Education and Partnerships at Second Nature, and we're delighted to have you join us this afternoon. Today, we're going to talk about what higher ed can learn from corporate renewable strategies, takeaways from the 2017 REBA conference. This is the first in our Crossing Sectors series, which is built upon the notion that in collaboration with businesses, state and local governments, higher education, and in particular, the Climate Leadership Network, will step up and lead the nation on climate action, given that there's a wee bit of a federal void at the moment. So today, Tim Carter, President of Second Nature, and Mike Volpe, Vice President for Open Road Renewables, are going to have a conversation to discuss the recent REBA conference and how to apply leading business expertise to campus renewable planning efforts. This webinar is a bit of a departure from our traditional, more technical webinar presentations, even though the technology looks the same. We're not going to have as many slides, and while there won't be a test at the end, we are going to bring you into the conversation by asking you to interact with us through a series of polling questions throughout the webinar. The webinar will be recorded, and we'll send the slides around to registrants after, but really we're viewing this as the beginning of a conversation. So we look forward to staying in touch afterwards to work with campuses interested in pursuing offsite renewables. We'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So I encourage you to submit questions at any time using the questions function on your GoToWebinar panel. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tim Carter, President of Second Nature, to go ahead and get us started.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm really happy to be here with Mike. We're not in the same place, but I feel like we share a history. We connected recently over our love of the Southeast in some ways, Southeast Conference in particular, in the Tennessee Vols as the preeminent college football entity in the Southeast. And we disagree on some things like that, but we also agree on a lot of other things. And so what we're hoping for today is that we'll be able to walk through some of the opportunities that we see from the corporate side. And as Second Nature, we don't have a whole lot of experience on the corporate side. Mike does, and the perspective that he's going to bring to this this conversation is going to be interesting and important. I will say too is we haven't, like Michelle said, we haven't done this before. So really, you got to be online. You got to do this polling online thing that hopefully will work. It should work, and if it doesn't, we'll blame me and Mike. Don't blame anybody else. But once we capture those answers, it's going to actually help inform our work even beyond this webinar. So it's not just something we're going to be responding to in real time, but actually something that will help us understand where you as a network are at, and hopefully inform some of the resources we provide moving forward throughout the year. One of the things we're interested in is scaled impact and accelerated impact, and we think learning from other sectors is one way we can help higher ed do that, and how higher ed can help others do that as well. So Mike, why don't you give just a quick overview about who you are and then what REBA is. Some people I'm sure on the call might have never heard of REBA and don't know anything about the conference, so it'd be good to hear a little bit of context.
Thanks, Tim. Good afternoon, everybody. Mike Volpe here with Open Road Renewables. I guess a little bit about Open Road and what we're doing. We develop utility scale renewable energy projects with a bit of a bias towards the competitive wholesale markets. I have about a decade in the renewable space on the technical finance development side. Let's talk a little bit about the REBA conference. REBA stands for the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. And the story is this: 4 or 5 years ago, a small handful of corporates, sort of the who's who in the corporate sustainability realm, including Google and General Motors and a few others, recognized the need to go off-site to hit their sustainability goals. And there was a group of 4 NGOs, the Rocky Mountain Institute, World Resources Institute, BSR, and World Wildlife Foundation or Federation, that banded together and said, hey, this corporate interest in offsite renewables is something that we can support. Let's be the platform for thought leadership. Let's be the platform for networking, and let's make it such that we can create an annual conference where folks get together and compare notes on how transactions are taking place, what they're learning, which markets are opening, how do we bring utilities into the conversation. So that's the Renewable Energy Buyers Association, and this conference just took place just about a month ago in Santa Clara, California. I was fortunate enough to attend. I think we'll talk today about some of the lessons or the takeaways from that conference and really what's transferable to the higher ed space.
Yeah. So you were there as you do this for a living, but the companies were there because they have demand for what you're providing, people like you. And there are a bunch of people like you there, as well as a bunch of companies there who are part of REBA.
Yeah.
Right?
And then the sort of the new party at the table were the utilities. More and more utility participation, which we certainly see as a good thing.
Interesting. So this gets us into kind of this first question, which is the motivation. Like, so why, would that smaller group come together? You mentioned that a little bit, but what is the general, on the corporate side, the general motivation for this large-scale renewable energy procurement? What did you learn from there? What have you heard from them?
I think it goes to sustainability goals. And if you think back over the last 5 or 10 years, there have been these first mover organizations, again, Google, Microsoft, General Motors, that stand up and say, we are going to do something about climate change. And we are going to do something about it because our employees care, our customers care, our shareholders care. And it was really part of the mission, part of the brand equity and the shareholder value for these first movers.
And that's kind of similar to, I think, what we've seen over the past 10 years, at least, with a lot of the schools that have joined the network, been part of the network, and have been really active, is that they say, hey, we want to, not only do we inherently care about it, but we want to distinguish ourselves and make a mark within the higher ed sector, at least, but also maybe more recently, some of these schools are trying to do things to push, what's possible even outside of the sector. Do you see that too, kind of on the same, you're saying the corporate side?
Yeah, and what's great is that, you have these first movers or early adopters that take risk in planting a flag. And then there's some validation that was the right thing to do, as there's a bit of a follow the leader theme that takes place, where you have the first mover in the tech sector that plants that flag, and then other corporations benchmark against that. And then that expands to other industries benchmark against the tech sector. So, when Walmart makes a big goal, you see Target just this week come out with a 100% renewable by 2050 goal, likely driven by the benchmarking to the goals that Walmart has made in that space.
Yeah, but we're also talking here about procurement specifically and not just goal setting. So I feel like we've been through this phase of goal setting, carbon neutrality. All these schools in our network have carbon neutrality as a goal. But now we're actually needing to act on the goal. And so, this is where, we're starting to see that amongst the schools, but it hasn't, flown off the shelves. And I guess I'm wondering, maybe this is the next question, Andrea, how do you see this, REBA and maybe what you're hearing from this group of buyers? How do you feel like they're fulfilling their goals, because now you're not just goal setting, but you're actually turning it into action? What does that look like moving forward for them?
Yeah, what's probably similar of the higher ed space and the Second Nature members is that these goals that have been set are very laudable. They're very impressive, but at times they're far out. The time horizon is such that, we've got 30, 40 years to accomplish the goal. So we've seen some interim goal setting taking place. And in terms of meeting the sustainability goals, it seems to be a rack and stack where you
What does that
want
mean?
to meet your you want to meet your sustainability goals in the most economic fashion, right? Ideally,
Okay.
there are things like efficiency, changing the thermostat settings, making plant improvements that all have positive ROI. And I think for the first half of 2010 to 2015, a lot of those initiatives have taken place. And now, as we look forward to big goals by 2020 or 2025, these corporates recognize that they've got to do something bigger, and offsite renewables are the play. And just a last point here, that's what REBA is all about, is renewable energy buying in the fulfillment of these sustainability goals. And it generally takes one of two paths: either a green tariff in a regulated state where the power industry has a regulated utility, or an offsite virtual PPA in a wholesale market. And that's what the conversation was all about.
Mm-hmm. And was it about the same on each? Were they talking green tariffs and wholesale markets equally, or was there kind of a leaning one way or another?
There's definitely a leaning towards the wholesale markets because they've been open for the longest. Green tariffs are starting to open. I believe there's 10 states right now that have green tariffs. World Resources Institute is definitely the subject matter expert on that, sort of the central clearinghouse thought leadership. And if folks have interest in learning about green tariffs, I'm working on one right now in Kentucky. I'd be happy to share the lessons learned for regulated states.
So we have this racking stack. So you've done, this is kind of the low-hanging fruit equivalent. Is that right? If it is, that's exactly, I think, what we've seen on the higher ed side too. We've seen a lot of, change out the light bulbs, do, different set points, and maybe do some more behavior-based programs, all of which are fairly low cost or have an ROI of very, very quick turnarounds. And now it almost sounds like we're mirroring the corporate sector in a lot of ways, starting to explore this next option.
Yeah, it sounds right. And it'd be interesting to hear from folks if that lines up with their experience. I don't know if this is the opportunity for the first polling question, but if it is, I'll pass it back to you, Tim.
Nice. Okay, so first polling question. So everybody, there we go. Look at that. So first polling question here, we wanted the audience to respond to this. Have you prioritized putting your GHG reduction to action from top priority to lowest? So how have you done it? So it's not, this is kind of the rack and stack. What does that look like? Now that I know what rack and stack means, basically, how have you prioritized it and in what ways? So these selections here will give us a sense of how people have done it. So let's take, now about 30 seconds to fill out these 5 options. And obviously there might be more, but take a little bit of time. We'll pause here for a second while you fill that out, and then we'll see what the poll says. Mike, do you have any Jeopardy music while we're waiting here?
Not queued up. Sorry, that's a miss.
That's a lesson. That's a first lesson learned. All right. Let's do 5 more seconds, and then we'll see what the results are. All right, Devin. Interesting. So prioritization, people have said conservation, energy efficiency, and that's across lighting and appliances and central plant. Presumably that's some efficiency. No on-site renewables or off-site renewables in the audience. That's kind of fascinating. Any thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I guess the only question is, are we getting to that point in time where folks in the audience are starting to think about renewables because they've worked through the most economic opportunities to fulfill their sustainability goals?
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, we can say this from Second Nature side, the data that people have submitted to us, we know that there are marginal changes, marginal improvements, but to get to the goals that a lot of people have articulated, we definitely are going to need to take some more aggressive steps, not just incremental steps. And it's not like the energy efficiency work and the on-site conservation it doesn't improve things. It actually improves things a lot. I was actually at a meeting yesterday where Wendell Brazzi, many of you may know him, presented on some of California's work, and they're over 50% now in energy efficiency on their campus operations at UC Irvine. And so you can get a big chunk done, but we're definitely at a spot where we want to move on a little bit further. So I guess this next question is following from that, and we didn't really queue this up knowing that there wouldn't be anybody who had identified renewables as a next step. But Devin, can you put up that next question? Or let's change the slide first. Okay. So maybe this is presumptive that it's bulk offsite renewables. I think maybe the point here too could be: are you at a point where you're satisfied with what you're doing on conservation, energy efficiency, and central plant upgrades, and there's plenty to do there, or do you feel like this is a self-selected group, but maybe you're looking to get into the renewable game a little bit? So why don't we take this should be a pretty straightforward answer. So maybe just 10 seconds on this one. See the answers there. All right, Devin. Nice. Okay, so serious consideration, having a hard time with the economics, about a quarter of you aren't looking to do offsite renewables, and 10% of you are currently in a transaction. Great. So this shows there's 50, 60, 70% interest. And maybe some of you in the 27% space might have a different idea on if it was general renewables as opposed to offsite renewables. That's great. So there's interest here. Any thoughts on that one, Mike, on these responses?
Super interesting. No, I mean, I think that not at this time. I'd love to learn more on why not. I hope the answer there is that there's just so many opportunities to do it in a way that's so cost effective that's the answer, and that people are taking steps forward regardless of how it is.
Yeah. Great. Okay, well, let's go next slide. Like we saw from that first polling question, people start on this efficiency front and behavior change, central plant upgrades, and if the on-site renewables or the off-site renewables would be easy, they'd probably already being done all over the place. So this is an obvious question. What are the challenges that the corporates were facing that you heard at REBA and other places? And then let's just think about how transferable those would be to higher ed. So what challenges were you seeing or hearing from the corporates? Like, if this is a no-brainer, why isn't it getting done?
Yeah, I think there's two main challenges that we heard about. One is this disconnect between executive level commitments and then getting the approval and the support internally to get the projects done. And two, somewhat as a surprise to me, there's more challenge in mapping the greenhouse gas reduction from an offsite renewable project than one would perceive. And maybe we can dig into each of those.
Sure. Yeah. So the first one, we would resonate with. And one of our targets has always been to try to bridge between the senior leaders and the implementation staff. And most people in the call are probably on the implementation side, and they, you might already have 5 different edicts that have come down from on high that you are trying to figure out how to navigate and negotiate. And oftentimes there is a disconnect between the goals that the senior leaders set. That would be easily reflective on higher ed, similar to what you said on the corporate side. So how are they trying to overcome that?
Yeah, same sort of concept here, where the execs are either the first movers or they're benchmarking, and they say, hey, let's do it. I'm going to make a bold commitment. We're going to have a lot of pomp and circumstance without all of the economic analysis being done. So there's 2 ways that this seems to be remedied. One is that there's an overarching, very bold goal, 100% carbon neutrality by 2050, and then the incremental commitments are made on a 5-year rolling forward basis as you have the bottoms-up analysis of what you can do. So let's say it's 50 or carbon neutrality by 2050, and it's 2017. You're going to say, okay, by 2023 we'll be at this amount of reduction, and then you keep moving it forward with the projects that you know that you can do. The second thing is there's always the need to properly frame the conversation for approvals when a project appears to be at par, maybe a little bit more expensive. The commitment on the executive side was made because of shareholder value, brand value, more recognition as a university, higher quality applicants, and that needs to be weaved into the conversation when approvals are being sought of why the project's being pursued.
Right. So in our space, in the higher ed space, it would be, here's how, I don't know that any campus would use brand equity per se, but a lot of campuses would say, here's why we'd be attractive to this next freshman class, which you clearly have goals around. And is that ever going into your financial spend calculation on the operation side? Probably not. There's probably not a whole lot of integration between tuition dollars and energy expenditures, but it's kind of making that case. It sounds like you're saying that's what the corporates are at least doing, maybe.
Yeah, that seems to be the one path with only so much success. I think the more analytical or numbers and dollars and cents approach would be the incremental goal setting. But once a goal has been set, that the cat may already be out of the bag on that one.
Well, that's relevant too. I know the past year we've now changed our practice to have a 5-year review of people's climate action plans. We don't dictate how you set those interim targets, but the idea that corporates are doing them, generally every 5 years or something that's kind of in manageable chunks, and then maybe having some level of iteration there after 5 you review. I could imagine, 5 years ago, your plan would see maybe some of these renewable projects as completely out of the possibility. And we might even get to this a little bit later. Why, if you're 5 or 10 years ago, how I could never do that as a campus or a corporate entity because the economics don't pencil out, or, I got to hope that there's some big price declines. Well, the price declines have happened, and so that's that idea of incrementally setting goals and then reviewing those goals, definitely something that we're trying to encourage on our side as well. Let's go on to this next poll. So this is a yes, no, simple yes, no. Have you experienced a disconnect in your commitments and challenges of meeting your goals and saving money? So this would be back to that original framing here, which is on the corporate side, they're also seeing that. And I was assuming that was the same on higher ed because we have heard that, but I would love to hear from the audience here. Since it's yes, no, I don't think we need to take a whole lot of time, maybe 5 more seconds, and then we can close it off, Devin. Okay. So it's a real phenomenon. They're in real time. It's not just us telling you that and saying that, but it is a real thing. Let's keep going. So I think there was, let's go on to the next question here.
And maybe I'll pick it up. The second area of challenge or frustration that we heard was the mapping of renewable energy transactions to GHG reduction accounting. Who would have known that by doing a renewable project or probably even an efficiency project, the GHG reduction accounting math is not black and white. I think that's exacerbated by the fact that some of the off-site renewable projects may be 50 miles away or they may be 500 miles away, and the fuel supply mix in the market where the off-site project is drives that, but that's an evolving fuel mix as well. So I guess the takeaway here is that this is an area of thought leadership or investigation that the corporate community is undertaking under the REBA platform. And it seems like if folks in the higher ed space have similar quandaries, there's an opportunity to compare notes, because it would be exactly the same analysis and investigation you would hate to duplicate if somebody's already running this down.
So what you're saying is, as we kind of work on this, the next slide coming up, because I think it's on there, you're saying that the physical proximity really does matter, because the utility mix that people are using for their accounting has some assumptions baked into it, and if you're changing that mix through a renewable energy procurement in that grid, or if the grid on itself changes independent of you, then that's going to change your accounting. And you're saying there's a disconnect between those two?
Or maybe even said a third way, where you're a university in, let's say, Michigan, and you choose to do off-site wind project in Oklahoma. The energy injected in Oklahoma is going to offset different fuel supply than energy injected in Michigan. And when you have an on-site efficiency project, you know what your local fuel supply is. But when you go off-site, and if you go to another market, it could be such that it takes more investigative work to understand what the GHG reduction benefit is of the off-site transaction.
I see. So this maybe gets into a little bit of the REC conversation too, where injecting it into a grid somewhere else and accounting for the environmental attributes, it's a little bit complex whenever you're doing these sorts of calculations and trying to understand how and what that looks like for the utility is one thing, and then how you're accounting for it to meet your internal goals is also another thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you captured it much better than I could have.
Well, let's test this. Let's go to that polling question. Next one is a polling question. So, is this a challenge for the audience? It's curious. Mike is expressing that it is a challenge on the corporate side, mapping your greenhouse gas reductions to renewable energy projects. I'm not sure that that's the same on higher ed, so I really am curious what the answers would be here. So yes, no. So two seconds on this one, and let's check out the results. Yeah, if I would have predicted, I would have said something like this. Where there's maybe a little bit of challenge, but it's not a slam dunk like it was on the on our prior question about the disconnect between senior leadership. And it may be the tool. That's the question. Would be is it the tool that we use to account, that most campuses use to account? Does it already embed some of that, grid displacement, or is there enough opportunity to customize it so that you don't have to run into challenges of a GHG accounting leading to some, misaccounting really for the projects that you're doing?
In thinking about this now, I would expect that part of the challenge comes from the early offsite projects primarily were ERCOT and SPP wind projects, where corporates have load throughout North America, and the offsite renewable project is in a different market. And the environmental benefit of that is different than what it would be if it was located closer to their facility. So this may be a bit of a legacy concern, and it may be such that future offsite renewable transactions will be closer to the university's campuses because of the improvements in specifically solar install costs. You're able to locate a solar project in Virginia, whereas before, if you were a corporation or a higher ed in Virginia, you'd probably be looking off-site to Texas wind. So I think that hopefully this will be a problem that will be solved by projects being closer to folks' campuses going forward.
Yeah, got it. Well, let's dig in a little bit more to the actual, procurement from corporate side. What does the current landscape look like? How does this happen? Are there, you're a developer, Open Roads in the development side, and how many corporates do you see contracting with people like you? And obviously we have one of our partners is actually on here, Customer First is a partner of Second Nature. What's this procurement landscape look like?
Yeah, so these off-site renewable transactions that the REBA members have pursued are relatively complex. You transition from being a sustainability professional to being a bit of a power markets expert. And most organizations will do one of these transactions, maybe two, over a 10, 15, 20-year time frame. Their load, like a campus, isn't growing notably. There may be a few facility additions, but it's not like a high-tech company that keeps warehousing more and more data in data centers. So the procurement landscape is built like this. You have 5, 6, 7 companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, GM again, probably Walmart, that have built out internal expertise on contracting for offsite renewables. A lot of the folks in these businesses that are leading these offsite transactions have come from the development or the finance space, and they've chosen to go lead these initiatives within those organizations. Well, that's a bit of a lofty aspiration, and it probably doesn't make sense for most Fortune 500s out there with the sustainability goals. So the landscape has been rounded out by probably 80, 90% of the other companies working with procurement advisors like Customer First, like Altenex, like Schneider, like Level 10. And there's a really nice component of this. I think two aspects are nice. And most people wouldn't think that a developer who would want to do business directly with a higher ed would be saying, hey, go work with an advisor. But there's two benefits.
Which is you. You're saying this. Okay. Yeah. Got
right.
it.
Yeah. This is me. Maybe three. So the first reason is you probably get the most competitive price and see all the projects in the market. Two, in the accounting and the narrative and the stakeholder engagement within the campus, these advisors have built the capability to shepherd one of these transactions through your organization. And as a developer, that's a huge value add where the transaction may make a lot of sense, but it may lose momentum because there's the inability to shepherd it through the internal organization. And then the third area, which is a new aspect, is the concept of demand aggregation. So let's say we've got 4 or 5 universities, and all the universities have between 1,500 and 2,000 students. It may be tough for them because of the scale of their load to go do the most cost-effective offsite project. But if somebody like Customer First pulls those 4 or 5 campuses together, they could aggregate that demand and then have a consortium that would be able to take advantage of the least cost renewable project in that region. So landscape is such that 10, 15, 20% of the very sophisticated buyers out there are doing this on their own. They've built out great internal expertise, and then the majority of the others are working with procurement advisors.
So, I mean, it's kind of funny. So a couple of things in response to what you just said. One is that aggregation we're definitely seeing. I mean, we've actually pushed this on a lot of the signatories as a great option because in a different way than the Googles and the Facebooks, there's actually natural affinity between schools, and there's an opportunity to aggregate through either a system or a region or some other affinity group of higher education institutions. And we're starting to see that play out in North Carolina and New York, possibly in Virginia and the Midwest and Texas. So there's all these different places where aggregation is seeming to emerge. So I would reflect that back as a yes, that seems to be happening in higher ed. I also have heard during our conversations that, and maybe this is the nature of higher ed, that people want to be able to do this complex work themselves or think they have the chops to do it, not necessarily on the sustainability staff side, but the faculty. So I think it's really interesting that, faculty do have that perspective of they are the researchers maybe in a field. But even in places that are as sophisticated as large corporate entities that are doing things very fast with high levels of demand on profitability, which universities don't have, a large proportion of them are still doing this third-party advisor, and it's only the kind of the biggest of the big who are able to internalize the expertise because, I guess, maybe you can comment on this, the market's changing so much, or there's so much, you have to be in the business of it in real time in order to make some good sense out of what the decisions look like moving forward for procurement. I feel like the university side is a little more like we actually do have internal capacity to do it ourselves, and that might be a little bit of a fail on our part to think we can do it ourselves, and all these other companies, actually use third-party advisors like you're talking about.
But what I'll say is there's no doubt that there's the intellectual capital within universities to figure this out. It probably takes a little bit more time, and you may not see the whole market. The benefit of working with a procurement advisor is they have really surveyed the whole market of all projects under development, and they can understand the different value prop of each project. And then further, there may be pitfalls in the transaction structure as a derivative or the way it's accounted for or the tenor that from an academic perspective, you may not have a quick answer to, whereas an advisor could say, hey, would love for it to be different, but this is the way it goes forward, or this is how the accounting treatment takes place. So there's some learning by doing that the advisors have the benefit from that, I would advise on that. A side note is there has been more and more interest in the advisor space. So, the prudent thing to do would be to fully flush out who the different advisors are and what their expertise is and experience is.
Got it. I'm glad you said that there is the intellectual capital of higher ed. That makes us feel better. Let's do a next polling question. So this is specific to that question. We weren't sure how many were thinking, if you're thinking about doing offsite, did you think you're going to work with a broker, or were you trying to do it internally? And so this was to get at a better understanding of where campuses were in their process as you consider these projects. Do you feel like you have the internal capacity, or do you feel like you're better off going with an outside broker? Let's do 2 seconds on this one too. This is a yes, no. Ah, beautiful. Who is that? Whoever did that is amazing. Okay, answer. So 2/3 yes, 1/3 no. Interesting. It'd be interesting to dig into this a little bit more on the no side, kind of the why question, and on the yes side, a why question, because both would be good feedback. So that's interesting. I think probably one of our lessons. Go ahead, Mike.
So I'm just going to joke here. If, those on the no, if you want to work directly with us, feel free.
That's true. That's right.
Reach out.
I mean, it does feel like the more complex, especially the aggregated projects where there's a lot of differing opinions. It's not as centrally controlled, and you want to make sure you balance all those opinions. It does help to have a third party, whether it's a broker or not. Somebody to facilitate the process is important. Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, one last thought here. Sort of what does steady state look like? It's interesting in states with retail choice, right? The competitive wholesale markets. Those numbers, probably 2/3 of energy buyers work with an advisor or work with a broker to get their retail electricity supply. Maybe 50-50, but maybe 2/3, 1/3. And this is a slightly more complex transaction. So if you think the retail supply side is more mature and there's a role for the brokers there, I was speaking with a retail supplier, a real big name, and we were talking about what this looks like 5 years from now. And my expectation is that you would see similar split between those that want to do it on their own versus work with an advisor, maybe slightly more go to an advisor because this is more complex than just, around the clock retail supply.
Right. Well, let's keep going here. So I think, we're talking through time as we're discussing the maturity of the industry, and probably the corporates had this experience as well, where early adopters might have found deals to maybe not be as lucrative or make money or lose money. What seems like some in the past have been out of the money. So the question was really about why is that the case, and what did we learn from that? Why did it happen? And does that inform, when people have a bad taste in their mouth, does that inform what the current market is like, or what you would see the future market being like, or at least how the corporates reflected that because they were early on doing some of these projects?
Yeah, this is such an interesting area, and this probably follows on the idea of you probably want to work with a procurement advisor, but you want to make sure that they're thinking around long-term value the same way that you are. So maybe the complementary approach would be to have some faculty support who really understand statistics and the power markets alongside an advisor. So here's what's happened. The projects that appeared to pencil 5 years ago were Panhandle wind projects, and the PPA was, call it $30 against a historic value of energy in that market at $34. So when you look at the power purchase agreement price and you look at the historic value of energy, it says, okay, there's a $4 benefit that I would receive for every hour that the wind's blowing if that continues. Well,
and when was this, Mike?
2010.
Okay.
2012.
So that's not that long ago.
Yeah. So as more wind has come online, and as gas has continued to lower, and as there has been more and more divergence amongst the power markets, if your load is not located close by the location of your offsite renewable project, you are losing the hedge aspect of the transaction. So the way these transactions go together, you have an offsite project that injects into the energy market that generates a real-time value of energy. Think of that as like a credit that you as the customer receive, and for receiving that credit, you pay a fixed PPA price. That credit, if you're located close by your facilities, should be correlated to the cost to serve your load. Well, what we've seen over the last 5 years, and I'm actually working on a white paper here, is that ERCOT and PJM, for example, have diverged over time in so much that ERCOT, where the wind project is, has softened more than PJM has. So the offsite wind project in ERCOT is out of the money, and it's out of the money more than the market has softened in PJM. So I've said a lot right there, but the main takeaway here is entities have gotten smarter that if your load is in the Mid-Atlantic or the Northeast or in the Midwest, it would be foolish to go down to the Panhandle and think about contracting for a wind project.
And so but you're talking about more on the hedge side. So that's because your current energy purchase, I'm not going to be able to say this right, but I'm just thinking if natural gas is the driver, natural gas prices, and those might be more like a commodity price. Is that still dependent on location too, or is that divergent on location as well?
I think what you're getting at is historically there was this sentiment that natural gas drove the wholesale market pricing, and if gas
everywhere,
is $2, gas is $2.50 per million BTU delivered in Texas, and there's a delivery charge to go to the Mid-Atlantic, it's $3.50, but that those moved in lockstep, in unison. When you have penetration of a lot of zero marginal cost renewables like wind in an area where it's very windy and there's a lot of wind additions, the market in ERCOT and SPP is still somewhat driven by gas pricing, but it's only driven by gas pricing the hours the wind's not blowing. The hours the wind's blowing, wind actually has an impact on the value of energy. So what statistics shows us is that whereas we thought if natural gas rose and fall that ERCOT and PJM would rise and fall in lockstep, that no longer is true. And for that, if you're thinking about an offsite transaction, the way to ensure that it's a prudent procurement in so much that it represents an effective hedge, you would want the facility to be located as close to the load zone that your load is in, that your campus is in.
Yeah, I see. Interesting. So that both explains some of that historic stuff, but also informs some of these decisions going forward, namely that closer might be better to some extent. There might be some limits to the closeness too, some trade-offs that you're not accounting for if you're just focused on physical proximity. Let's go on to the next question. Or is it a poll? Okay, yeah, poll. So this is really just getting at that from the audience. So we're curious your perspective. How much does location matter? And I guess, this question is, it might be hard to tease out the why here, but the idea would be maybe based on what we talked about from a pricing perspective, but then of course there's other reasons why location of off-site matters to you. You might want to, physical research that you want to do on the project might be easier if it's closer, or do you want to be able to have your alumni visit or whatever it is. We won't be able to get to the why here, but it would be nice to know how much people cared about the physical location. All right, let's check out results. So basically 2/3 at least somewhat, and then another third is not so much. So it might be interesting to consider on both sides the whys behind that. If not much is more, wherever you can get the value. So it may be close or maybe far away, and the ones that are close, if it's significantly, a third of you said that significantly matters, then the why question behind that. If it's just economics or for other reasons, it'd be nice to tease that apart. What do you have next? You want to comment on that at all, Mike?
Interesting. I think that that's an area that all of us that have sort of an academic interest in this field should keep our eyes tuned to. We sort of live in the wholesale market space and look at the data all the time. And I think that there's some really interesting statistical observations that will drive future decisions, and those that are attuned to the statistics will make better decisions than those that are somewhat just looking at the lowest price wind deal as being the highest value.
Right. Interesting. So just a couple more questions here, and then we have a few questions from the audience. So where do you see, actually go back a slide. Where do you see innovation taking place? Where were the corporates saying, innovation in renewable energy procurement, large scale renewable energy procurement? Where's that taking place right now?
Yeah, I think a few things. We talked about aggregation. That's a huge theme and such a great opportunity that everybody should be supporting and interested in. Hub settlement for transactions, these offsite renewable projects injecting into the wholesale markets are a relatively new construct, and historically the settlement has been at the busbar. The corporates and the advisors are pushing for hub settlement. That's a concept that we could probably spend 30 minutes talking about that doesn't make sense to jump into now. Slightly shorter offtake contracts. The project developers and owners really have a preference for a 20-year power purchase agreement, but we're seeing them go as short as 15 years, maybe some markets even down to 12 years. Green tariffs are a huge opportunity in regulated markets. Let's say we're down in Alabama and we want to do renewables in a big way. Well, let's try and work with Alabama Power to develop an offsite project and have them sleeve it. That is a huge growth opportunity. And then lastly, where we're not quite yet seeing the innovation is on the storage side or solar paired with storage. I think if you read Green Tech Media, there's a lot of chatter about it, but we're not seeing those numbers pencil or make a ton of sense yet. So that's probably what I would say. How about you, Tim?
Well, definitely on the aggregation, we're seeing tons of interest there. I would say the contract length is brought up from time to time, with shorter being somewhat better, although since higher ed is such a long-term landowner, they're going to be in their locations for a long time. We tend to hear that they can use longer-term accounting to make it pencil out, and so sometimes the contracts, it's more just about risk than it is about, are we going to extract is the life cycle analysis of this going to pencil out? So, and then I'm not the expert here, so I would rely on those schools that are in these regulated markets to know what those opportunities are. I know there are a lot of schools that are there, and it does seem like it feels a bit limiting, the regulated market question. It feels like people can do less there, and maybe program like, emerging green tariff programs would be the way to get around it. I'm sensitive to time here. I knew this was going to happen. Let's do one more question, because I think that maybe front in everybody's mind. No, not the polling. Go back one. Sorry. I was really thinking about the federal context, and because the corporates are probably as much on top of this as anybody, given the Clean Power Plan and the federal administration's, pull out of many, or rollback of many of the climate regulations. What were you hearing from corporates on incentives or policies, either at the federal level or other levels, impacting?
Yeah, a few things here. One, the great news is a lot of energy policy is actually driven at the state level. I think CPP was one of the big top-down opportunities, but historically we've worked so much at the state level. I'm sure higher ed is appreciative of that. Two, they say there's more demand in the corporate commitments on sustainability goals for renewables than would have come from the Clean Power Plan. And I think from the We're Still In effort that I know a lot of the Second Nature members made that commitment, people are pretty emboldened. Last thought here is I have a real strong sense of optimism that corporates sort of survey their customer base and then make decisions that are prudent upon that. And in this two-party political system that we live in, sometimes decisions are not reflective of the majority of how folks feel, but I think that corporate's decisions generally reflect their perspective of where the majority is or where the best market opportunity is. So to see these large commitments, should it continue to give us confidence that, yes, the majority of consumers, employees, investors do care about this, and that's why there continue to be these commitments that's leading to more renewable transactions.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, let's see if we can hit this one more poll question. There's a little bit of question whether this is going to work or not. You want to try it? We already did it. Sorry about that. So the poll is around, would the audience like to learn more? So we might, here's what we'll do on this one. We'll send that out as a follow-up survey to after this webinar's over. Apologies for that. We can go on to the next slide. Okay, so there was one more question from the audience that, Mike, I wanted to run by you. It said, one additional challenge for higher ed is the risk associated with available offsite renewable energy contracts. So maybe there's a level of comfort with existing wholesale purchasing, and by entering into a new offsite contract, maybe there's some risk associated with it, both in terms of pricing and, like you were discussing earlier. Any thoughts on how corporates are using offsite contracts to mitigate that risk, or the risk attached to entering into a new PPA?
Yeah, so let's talk through the risk. The first risk is the project location not being proximate to the facilities. We sort of spent a little bit of time on that. The second risk is the production of the renewable facility being at different times from when the campus facility uses that. The third risk would be that the prices are such that wholesale power continues to get cheaper and the transactions out of the money. And the fourth would be that the facilities are no longer there because of the fact that the corporate or the university has moved its location. I would actually think that, given the creditworthiness and the fact that universities are much more permanent aspects of a community than a corporate facility, the risks are certainly there, but so too is the risk of currently being short on your energy supply. Most folks have a 1, 2, 3 year forward, but the life of your facilities greatly extends beyond that. So if you're to take a really academic approach to this, you would think about it as like portfolio theory, and you would say, I want 30% of my supply on a 3-year basis. I want 30% on a 10-year forward. I want 30% on a 20-year forward, and the balance, based upon the index, and you keep rolling that forward to have the best, achieve the efficient frontier. It would be really, really good. I would be happy to spend some time talking about risks and how to contract around that, how to think about it, because I do believe that some of the risks that's perceived as a bit of a framing aspect where, come year 4 right now, year 4 from now, we're exposed to what the energy markets are. Whereas if you had an offsite solar or wind transaction, you may be able to reduce your exposure.
Yeah. Got it. Well, that cues us up nicely. I feel like this is the first of many conversations. Obviously, hopefully the audience knows that Mike knows a whole lot more about this stuff than I do, and that's the reason why we partner with people like him. Mike, Open Road's been great so far, and just helping us understand opportunities for signatories. We want to extend that into the future. So be looking out for future of these conversations. I did want to mention the slide here is about the summit that we have coming up in February. Just so everyone knows, it's February 4th through 6th in Tempe this year, and we'll be talking much more with folks like Mike about solutions at scale for the network. This is going to be cross-sectoral and really all about driving solutions for the network and beyond. So please do register for that. I think there's still a little bit of a discount, early bird going on. So I want to thank everybody for attending. I know this is we took up the full hour. Thanks for all your feedback. I think what we're going to do, Michelle, are you going to close this out? Because I think we do have we'll send out a survey and make sure we'll be back in touch.
We will. We'll be back in touch.
Okay. Well, thanks,
Great.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
We'll catch you on the next one. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.